At the age of 6, Joseph Munyambanza found himself here. It's a refugee camp in Uganda. He had fled here together with about 23,000 inhabitants from countries like the Congo, Sudan, Rwanda, and Burundi. He was alone, he was bewildered, and several thousand kilometers from his home. In this community of 23,000 people, there were only 2 primary schools and 1 secondary school. And so as you can imagine, access to education, to quality education, was not very prevalent in the community. And the schools were overcrowded. And so very few people had access to high quality education. Now, Joseph was spotted by a non-profit organization that was working in the community as someone who had talent. And they sponsored him to go to a school outside of the refugee camp. And Joseph felt so bad that he was the only one who had access to education, that he decided that he would do something about it, or access to high-quality education. And so he began a program where on the weekends he would get together with his peers, and they would go and work as laborers on farms nearby and raise money to use that to sponsor others in the school, in the refugee camp, to go to schools outside of the camp as well. And soon, he was sponsoring 10 young people in his community to go to school. He was 14 years old. He kept doing this. Every weekend they'd go work as laborers, raise more money. And soon, by the age of 17, he was sponsoring 52 children in his refugee camp to go to school. Now, at this point, 2008, February 2008, we were selecting the first class to join the African Leadership Academy. So we went around the entire continent looking for young people that we believed could transform Africa. People with courage, determination, and passion to really change the continent forever. But I didn't hear about Joseph in those travels. I actually learned about Joseph when I was speaking at the Harvard Africa Business Forum, something similar to this. And just like what's going to happen after this, there's an after party. So I was hanging out at the after party, and this scrawny white guy comes up to me, and he says, you know, I didn't even pay to be at this conference, but I snuck into this party because I heard you were going to be here. There's this young man in this refugee camp in Uganda that my organization sponsors. He's amazing. And he went on and on, and the way he was talking about this guy, he sounded like a saint. So I said, no, this is not good, it's too good to be true. So I went back to South Africa and looked through the files of all the applicants and read this guy's story. And yes, it was exactly what Eric had said about him. And so we admitted Joseph into the first class of the African Leadership Academy. Now, one of the things that happens at the Academy, in addition to educating these young people and training them to be transformative leaders for Africa, is we bring different leaders and speakers onto campus all the time to interact and share their experiences with these young people. One day, a woman came and shared the work that she was doing to help people overcome trauma, people who had been traumatized overcome trauma, and she was using theater as the way to do this. And Joseph said, you know, people in my refugee camp could really use you, and invited her to come and spend a few days with her during his summer holidays at the end of the first year. So she went, saw what he was doing, and fell in love with his project. So Joseph's second year, she helped him to raise about $10,000. And soon Joseph built a school in the refugee camp in his second year at ALA, and began educating 243 orphans. Now this is the school that you can see behind him, and that's Joseph. June 2010, Joseph graduates from the African Leadership Academy. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to get a scholarship to go on to university. He had been admitted but didn't have enough funding to go to university. So he went back to his refugee camp and kept working on his projects, educating more young people, educating these orphans. And one of the organization I started, something called the African Leadership Network. Now, the African Leadership Network is an association of young leaders from across Africa, but who are a little bit more established than the ones at the African Leadership Academy. So in their 30s, 40s, and 20s. And once a year, we bring these leaders together so they can forge relationships with each other and actually do things together. So about 70% of the people that we bring are Africans living on the continent, 20% are Africans living in the diaspora, and 10% are non-Africans who are doing interesting things in Africa. Now, Joseph shared his vision for education, what he was doing in the refugee camp. And he had a vision specifically to build a hostel, well, to rent a hostel outside of the refugee camp so that some of the young people from there could get access to high-quality schools outside of the refugee camp. Remember, I said that there was only one secondary school in the refugee camp, and it only went up to 10th grade. So this is what happened when Joseph spoke at the African Leadership Network.
In 2012, we plan to take 110 students into high school, and to do this, we need $13,000. I'm sure $13,000, 2 or 3 mentors are in this room today.
Young man from Congo, I'm going to commit the 13,000. This will be from a client by the name of Curtis Jackson, who has a huge initiative to work in Africa. And on his behalf, thank you so much for this opportunity to help. Thank you.
Now, who here knows who Curtis Jackson is? That's right. Right? 50 Cent. He had been sponsored by 50 Cent. And soon, he was able to get an additional 100 young people into school, and he was sponsoring now 343 young people to go to school. These are some of the young people that he's been working with. That's him leading a pep talk with some of the high school students that he had sent to school. And that's him teaching them a few things. Joseph graduated. After a few more months of doing this, he was able to get a scholarship and ended up attending a university in the US called Westminster College. So Joseph now is in his second year at Westminster College in Missouri. He's continuing to run his program in the refugee camp. And now today he controls an organization with a budget of $186,000 and 10 full-time employees. What I especially am excited about is that he's begun sponsoring some people from his refugee camp to some of the universities. So he, at Westminster, where he is right now, there's a freshman there who came from his refugee camp and was one of the participants in his program. He sent a student to University of Rochester, including the first girl ever to graduate and go to university from the refugee camp. And especially dear to me is he sent 2 students who have come to the African Leadership Academy now. These are the 2 students that I took a picture of them earlier on this week, Tessia and Jean-Bat. They also came from his program. As a result of all this work, Joseph recently was introduced to the former UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, and who, as you know, is now the UN Special Envoy on Education. And he has also been invited and serves as one of 15 young people on the UN Secretary General's Special Advisory Council for Youth on Education. So Joseph sent me an email in September of this year telling me about how he had spent his summer holiday. He talked about how he had gone back to the Congo. He hasn't been there for many years. And as a result of connections that he has with Gordon Brown and the UN Secretary General, he's now meeting with the Chief of Staff of the President and the Minister of Education and his entire cabinet. And he's identified that there are 7 million children in the Congo who are out of school. And his objective was to see how he could get 1 million of these young people to go to school. And the first step towards that was he managed to get, at the end of the summer, the Minister of Education of Congo, they had expanded the education budget by 20%. And they're now well on their way to his goal of 1 million. Now, if this is not a ripple effect, I don't know what is. He went from just within the scope of 5 years, from touching 10 people to 52, to 242, to 343, and now 1 million. And he's only 22. The example of Joseph really illustrates what I believe is one of the most powerful ripple effects that we can ever have in any society. And that is the impact of leaders. Now, one might think that, okay, of course, leaders make a difference in every society. But I believe that in Africa, more than anywhere else in the world, leaders, just one person, one good leader, can have much more impact in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And here's why. There's something that we call institutions that exist in every society. Institutions are the rules and the systems that govern how a society functions. So these are things like your constitution, the media, the judiciary, the parliament system, all of those things. The rule that I believe is that the stronger the institutions in a given country, the less effect one leader can have in that country. And therefore, by the inverse of that means that the weaker the institutions in a country, the much, much more powerful effect that just one person can have in that society. So when you look at a developed country like the UK, your parliament, Big Ben, you walk past that place, it's been around for 500 years. You look at the US, got very developed systems. So if you become the president of the United States, and you think, oh, I've arrived. I'm the most powerful man in the world. And you decide, okay, I think Americans should get health care. I'm going to pass a law to make this possible. You go to the Senate, they say, no, 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 you can't do that. You go to the Congress, they say, no, you can't do that. If you decide that you want to become president for life, there's a 300-year-old constitution that will stop that. There's a very powerful police force, and so that will come and take you out of that Oval Office. If you decide you want to print money, and you call Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan, the central bank governor, they'll say, are you smoking crack? You come to Africa, the situation is different. If you are the president of Zimbabwe, and you decide that, you know what, I just want to stay in power forever. There's no constitution that's going to stop you. And you just stay on and on and on and on, like the Energizer Bunny. If you decide that you want to print money, and you call your central bank governor, the guy will say, okay, yes, sir, how much do you need? And as a result, hyperinflation ensues in that country. And so the lack of these institutions in Africa have meant that our leaders have had tremendous impact on us. Just one person, like Robert Mugabe, can destroy an entire country. And this is why I say that leaders in Africa can have much more impact than anywhere else in the world. They are really the ultimate ripple effect in Africa. And this is why myself and my peers were really inspired to develop the African Leadership Academy. When we realized that this was the single biggest thing that was holding us back from achieving our potential as Africans, was the quality of the leaders that we had. We said, do we just sit back and hope that one day we get good leaders? Or can we create a system, a machine, that can actually find young people and develop them? Hundreds and thousands of young people like Joseph. who each in their own way, you know, I looked in my lifetime when I was growing up, I grew up in different parts of Africa. And everywhere I went, I saw we had different problems: healthcare, infrastructure, poverty, housing, sanitation, and it was overwhelming. Where would I start? But I thought, there's no way in my lifetime that I can try and tackle all these things. But if I can produce a set of leaders, and those leaders, this one will take infrastructure, that one will take politics, this one will take healthcare, this one will take education, and each and every one of them, in their way, will go out, and they will become the leaders that can really transform Africa. And as I mentioned, just one leader in Africa can have a very, very powerful effect on that society. And that's really what's inspired the African Leadership Academy. Today we get several thousand applications, and we pick only 100. People say, how can 100 people change Africa? I say that we don't need a lot of people to transform Africa. We just need a few good leaders. So when you walk into the walls of the African Leadership Academy, everywhere there's a quote that I like, that is all over the place. It's my favorite quote. It says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I believe in Africa, I would rewrite that statement that says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed leaders can change Africa. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever will. Thank you.